Welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I want to thank all of you guys for joining us. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict, futurist at TCS. And I want to welcome my guest today, Joe Carson. Joe, thanks for joining us.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Joe is the CEO and founder of Spend Strategies. He's also the former chief procurement officer of both Micron and Lucent. So he brings with him all kinds of in-depth, real-world experience from supply chains and logistics and all the stuff that we find so interesting here. So Joe, talk to us about how did you end up focusing on supply chain risk management?
Yeah, Kevin, I'll tell you, especially evident today when we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? If you're in the area of supply chain and you're in the area of procurement, really risk these days has to become a part of it. Because of what's happened over the past couple of decades, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, there's been a lot of dissemination of suppliers out into the supply chain, out into the world. And so what happens is you've got not only tons of suppliers that are dispersed all over everywhere, but you've got the events and the things that cause disruptions that could affect them. If you're not involved in supply chain risk and you don't have that visibility out to what's happening with suppliers all the way out to the end of the earth, you'll never know what's going to happen to your factory and to your customers. So that's really become an integral element of supply chain management, is supply chain risk management.
So you and I know each other. We've been able to have coffee together a few different times. Mm-hmm. You use a word often or a phrase called risk culture. You say companies need to have a risk culture. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so being in a supply chain world and hanging around with supply chain folks, we are just get it done people. We kind of like that challenge, and we kind of like when we're under the gun and kind of make things happen. The ball gets hit, it's hit really far away, and you've got to just run and dive, and you catch the ball, and the crowd roars, and we kind of get used to that level of working in the regular supply chain world. But when you think about a risk culture, you got to think differently about what's happening in your role. In a risk culture, you think about the events that could happen in the future and how you can be proactive and be prepared or prevent a bad thing from happening with your company. It's really kind of a difficult role, because if you're a person with a supply chain risk culture and you're inside of the supply chain organization, you'll have a lot of people telling you, oh, don't worry about it. You're wringing your hands over nothing. There'll never be a global pandemic. Factories don't catch on fire. We don't need to worry about that. But in reality, with a risk culture, you're always worried about that. You're making plans. You're thinking about what could happen, what might happen. What would you do in case? Are we prepared? Can we develop a plan? Can we practice the plan? Do we have enough people? Is a training in place? All those elements become really an integral part of that kind of risk culture.
So we've been, when you watch the news and you read the papers or any of the news today, you're hearing about these supply chains that are worldwide and how suddenly they're not working. You're not getting the different parts that you need, or the ventilators or the masks or things like that. They're manufactured overseas and all that. Now, you've been around for some time in your role. How did we end up where it seems like all these critical components and products are all made on the other side of the world?
Oh yeah, there's a little bit of history in there. I'll have to go back a few decades to kind of explain kind of how we got here, and I'll move through that quickly. So, going back to, if you could go back to 2000, 2001, when there was that whole .com bust, if you remember that, that was a pretty difficult time, a pretty deep recession that lasted a long time. I was with a technology company that really had to do some drastic measures. We couldn't believe the decisions that we were having to make in the moment to do the things that we had to do to survive as a company. So one of the things we did, and other companies just like us did, and not only in the technology industry, but in pharmaceuticals and tons of other industries, is we had to go to some place where the cost was lower. And mainly labor. Back in those days, labor was a huge component of our manufacturing cost. So we had to move our factories somewhere where the labor cost was low. That was not typically in the United States. That was in some far off places. Back then, it was predominantly over in China. There was a lot of factories that were moving first of all along the exterior of China, and then over time more into the interior, in seek of that lower labor cost. So that kind of put us in that spot where not only did we move our factories over there, but then we needed suppliers that were closer to those factories. So those suppliers were picked by the companies that were over in that part of the world. So then not only did we have our main assemblers over there in our factories, but the sub-tier suppliers underneath them. And guess what? After them, they needed suppliers. So the suppliers to our factories needed suppliers. And those factories and those locations were all local over in very far lands over in Asia. Then we realized, golly, here we are in a situation where suppliers are now very far away. The sub-tiers below them were picked by other people. In some cases, we didn't know, who they were, what their locations were, what their situations were, or even who to contact if there was a disaster. And that kind of got us in that spot. It's a little bit how we got involved with risk in your earlier question about risk and procurement. As soon as there was a problem, you go, great, where did it happen? Who do I call? What's their phone number? I have no idea who these people are. And that kind of told us we needed to wake up and kind of, move the ship in the other direction.
So what did you do to have greater visibility in that kind of multi-tier supply chain?
Yeah, it's a bit of unraveling all this back and said, okay, I've got multi-tier suppliers, but who are they and who picked them and what do I know about them? So we had to go through a multi-tier effort to go to our suppliers and then their suppliers and map all that out. And let me give you an idea of how daunting that task can be. We may have 100 suppliers, let's say, for 80% of our spend in a particular company to make a product. But if you think about your most important product that you have to ship, that's the most important to your revenue in making the quarter, sometimes that's thousands of suppliers. Yes, you may have a very expensive semiconductor component that makes a huge part of their cost, and you know everything about what needs to happen. You have plenty of buffer inventory of that one piece. But if you can imagine what it takes to ship that product, the little screws that go in the side of the assembly, the labels that go on the side of the unit, even the box that it goes in is critical to have. And that could be thousands of suppliers. So you have to map all that out. You have to have communication protocols. So if an event were to happen at their site, you get reflected back and you can status with them and know exactly what's happening. And you've got to be able to communicate with them what's happening for you real time, and so that you can coordinate your supply chain efforts after an event occurs.
So in this event, Joe, like this COVID-19 pandemic that we're all sitting in, I mean, that's shaking us all.
Yes.
And we're seeing things through new eyes and new views, and we're recognizing problems that we just never imagined we would have. How do you think it's going to impact things? What's your observation?
Well, I think a couple of things have happened. First of all, when the water goes down, it shows the big rocks, and it shows, the challenges that we have ahead of us. And it shows how we're dependent upon these sources of supply that are in foreign lands. One of the things that's kind of unique about this pandemic is the immense scale. So in any other pandemic situation or any other kind of event situation we've seen, whether pandemic or not, it's actually been fairly localized. Maybe it's a volcano, maybe it's a tsunami, maybe it's some other situation. But what we've seen here is it's on a massive scale. So you may look to this one channel for a source of supply and see that doesn't work, and in past, maybe you can turn to another one. But in this one, it kind of exposes, wow, for some critical elements, and that's been true, we've seen of biopharmaceuticals and of medical supplies, wow, we need to have much better assurances of supply from the beginning low-level suppliers, the sub-tiers that bring in the materials we need, to the assembly, to logistics suppliers to get things here, right here in the United States. And I think this COVID crisis will be kind of a wake-up call that some of those movements back from the past will have to move back toward the United States and have much more assurances of supply.
Mm. I'm sitting here thinking, in some of those situations, some of those disasters that we've all experienced over the last several decades, the tsunamis, the hurricanes, you name it, those were mostly an impact on the supply side.
Right.
But with this, the demand and supply side are just going, crazy in unpredictable ways.
Absolutely. And that wreaks havoc on supply chain organizations because we haven't talked much about supply chain planning that kind of takes into account the demand side. What are the things that I need at its highest level? And then how can I work the supply side? How can I get the things I need to go build that? But we've got kind of conflicting cross currents on this going both ways. It's a little bit why you've seen, and again, very amazing thing. Um, all elements of America kind of coming together, both even the private sector and the public sector. So the government's working together with industries and having to do some amazing coordination. You see exchanges coming up, looking to move products around between different entities. Really has been amazing to see how all that's kind of been pulled together.
Yeah, there's been a number of instances in the news recently about the commercial sector and government working together. What have you been hearing out there?
Yeah, the same thing, and I think some of it is, and again, if you're kind of a supply chain risk person, you're used to the fact that, wow, when events happen, you're not only doing, but you're learning. And I think one of the things we're learning is how to do that kind of coordination on such a grand scale. So you hear a lot of talks about, what's at the state level, what's at the federal level, who does what. If we find that a group of constituents have a need, how do we engage? And we're missing some key elements that we need. How do we engage companies that formerly made automobiles and now they're making ventilators? It's just amazing. That pivot and that ability to turn a factory from one direction, your standard products for your core markets, to do the things that we need to do in a crisis is a bit of a learning. And I think an important point to bring out, Kevin, is the advances we've made in technology. It's almost like we're realizing, golly, we can do this. We have things like 3D printing. We're more based upon factory automation that's designed and pointed by software code that can be changed. We're much more agile than we were. I told you before about how we moved plants because of labor markets.
Mm-hmm.
Now with things being more based on automation, you can now turn a factory, I'll say, more easily. Not that it's been an easy endeavor for anybody. It's been an amazing endeavor, and those people should be lauded for their work there. But we're at a point where we can start thinking about how can we leverage the things that we've learned there, that automation and that capability, into something that really helps America out for the next crisis we have like this.
How can we be better prepared for the next pandemic?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is picking up on this point about learning our lessons from the last time. What is it that we need to do to pick out more local sources of supply when we need to? That doesn't mean that we abandon all of our operations, or that cost isn't an issue. It still is an issue, and we still have to work that. And there are several elements of this problem that still need to be worked out. But I do think that we can learn and transform the way that we make products, so that if we find ourselves in a crisis again, we can go to a script, we can go to a protocol, and we have better tools and better experiences at our disposal now to be able to turn the company toward a crisis and do the things that we need to do. See how all of Americans have come together. See how we've worked with companies from not only in the U.S. but around the world to solve our problems. Those experiences are available to us to go do that.
I just read a paper here in advance of our interview where you were proposing a program called S.A.F.E Supply Chain. Talk to us about that.
Yes, keep Americans safe, S.A.F.E. So the way I kind of have been thinking about this, Kevin, and of course, it's true for America, but I think any country could come up with their own analog to this. So it's kind of a model that would be good for anywhere in the world. But thinking about the fact that sometimes when times get tough and it's a crisis, you've got to really have an avenue that's local to you to be able to meet demand and do the things you need to do for your citizenry. So the concept around S.A.F.E is really 4 elements. First of all, source. So sourcing locally. Again, our ability to source local is different than how it was back 20 years ago. We now have less of a dependency on high cost labor. It's not zero, it's still an issue. But when you think about the capital equipment that you need, that perhaps you can provide tax incentives to go for companies to invest in, to have that kind of capital and that factory automation that can allow us to build materials less expensively than the past. Oh, by the way, maybe we use this excuse to really develop our factory automation leadership in the world, and really develop that as the core competency of who we are. There's still other issues to go solve in terms of cost, but how we source in selecting local suppliers and going through what procurement organizations do already, which is develop a sourcing strategy, but pick a local sourcing strategy that's on the ready if we were to have a local need. The second one is activate. You asked me before about how government and privates have come together, and we've seen some incredible activation of all these different groups and organizations of how they've come together in an amazing way to do what they needed to do. I think we could learn those lessons and develop that kind of protocol and oversight. So if we were to ever have a problem again, we could activate the right set of resources to pivot their organizations in order to meet whatever the current situation is. I was telling you before about some of the roles we have in the role of supply chain risk. Having supply chain risk specialists inside these companies that could come to our aid and come to our need when we need it, having be that focal point. I know when I had to do this inside a procurement organization, it would be great to have the experience and the insights and the constant communications come from the government agencies about problems they see, have that coordination that helps us get even smarter. And then in a time of crisis, if you had a role like that in place, those people could also be a conduit, not only down to the factory, but as the factory pivots and does what it needs to do to be responsive to whatever the crisis is, it could reflect that back up to whoever's the organizing agency around that particular crisis. The third is F is in fabricate. So make what we need. And again, we've seen some incredible transitions with some companies. Awesome that they're either able to make what we need or pull from stockpiles. The stockpiling idea is one that you've seen a lot of criticism about. Where are stockpiles that we prepare for it? If we had the right sourcing in place and the right activation and oversight in place that I talked about earlier, developing those stockpiles would also be in place to the extent that we needed it. So now we have a way of kind of managing and have a buffer, if you will, for if there's a crisis. And the last one, of course, is extend the things that we make and manufacture to get to people in need quickly. Not to take anything away from the response time that we've seen here in the U.S. As a supply chain person, it's been amazing. In the matter of months, the things that we've been able to do to both source and fabricate, the first part, but the extension that we've made out to folks has been terrific. But that kind of same learning about the logistics that we need to put in place, and the way we can convey those materials that we might develop for the next crisis, because who knows what the next crisis is, to be able to pivot that and turn that where it needs to go is an amazing capability. And the last point about extend is extend our thinking. So again, thinking about that next crisis and thinking about what is it that could happen next. Unfortunately, as much as we think we've learned a ton off of this pandemic called COVID-19, the next thing is going to be something else. It could be a different profile of pandemic, a different type of disease that needs different equipment. Could be a cyber virus instead of a human virus. Right. It could be some other major calamity that we need to prepare for. But again, when you have that risk culture that you asked me about in the beginning, you kind of have that rhythm of, let me think through all the possibilities, let me think through all the things that could go wrong, and then let me list those and prepare for what's next. So that kind of rounds out the SAFE, that extension of our thinking into the next crisis.
I was talking to another expert in supply chain the other day, and he said, you know what, you just have to keep going through these different scenarios. You have to practice and think through them. What does scenario practicing mean to you?
Yeah, so again, part of that whole risk culture is developing that methodology and that discipline of saying, I don't know it till I see it for myself. When I used to do this with companies and they would show me their plan, I'd say, well, I want to make sure that this is more than a 3-ring binder with a bunch of names in it. I want to see the person that's doing it, that it has to respond in the middle of the night to a problem. I want to know I have their cell phone number, and I want to watch that they've practiced it. They know what to do, and this is something that's a bit of a routine. It is a big part of that supply chain culture of practicing those items, being sure that you audit the things that you find when you practice, identifying the needs for training, being sure those people are in place and trained and ready to go for the next crisis.
All right, Joe Carson, thank you for joining us today. And I want to thank everyone out there for tuning in.